Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, and today we will assess the EU Chips Act with Nicolas Poitier and Pauline Veil, whom have been working on the topic within our research team. Pauline, Nicolas, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Giuseppe, for having us.
Thanks, it's really good to be here.
Drawing lessons from the ongoing shortages in chip supply, the United States, China, and the European Union are adopting industrial policies in the semiconductor sector in search for supply chain security and economic and technological competitiveness. Could we describe to our listeners what a semiconductor is, first and foremost, and what does the current value chain looks like, and the context in which such initiatives are taking shapes?
For sure. Thank you, Giuseppe. So first and foremost, I think it's important to understand why semiconductors are so important. Since the start of the technology revolution, semiconductors have been at the center of every major innovation. And now, as we go and as the world is becoming more and more digitalized, they are increasingly important and produced and consumed by an increasing number of industries. In this context, major actors like the US and China have been striving to be able to produce their own and control the value chains for this important commodity. So this is, I would say, the first context in which all of these massive investments are happening. The second context that we have seen since basically the COVID crisis is major supply chain disruptions that have translated into shortfalls. And these shortfalls have had big economic impacts in the sense that some industries have had to close factories, and it created a big mess in major supply chains, such as, for instance, in the automotive sector. And so it's in this dual context of striving for tech supremacy and geopolitical confrontation that the US and China especially want to invest, but also in this context of economic crisis and supply chain disruptions that all of these same actors, including the EU, are investing massively to support the industry.
Nicholas, would you like to add something to this?
Yeah, maybe just a few words about the geopolitics of this, because we have seen on the one hand the importance economically in the shortages, and this is maybe primarily an economic story, but there is also a geopolitical story behind this. China is highly dependent on imports of semiconductors. If you look at the products that China exports, 96% of what the US declares as high-tech imports coming from China are ICT goods like smartphones, TVs, computers, and these kind of things. And China has to import on the high end all of its chips from abroad. And the US has used this for sanctions against China. For instance, in the struggle around 5G, it has banned the export of chips, not just from the US, but from any company that use US technology to this company. But we also seen this now in the context of Russia, where the US, EU, and our partners, including Taiwan and Japan, have imposed sanctions on semiconductors. So really here, semiconductors have become a key good because they're used in almost everything, and the supply chains are so integrated, they've become a key good used for sanctions. And China is really aware of this, and I think this is the background for their big push for semiconductor independence, which so far they have not managed. And I think this is the background why, on the one hand, there's the economic story about this being really important, the shortages, but also the geopolitical story, seeing this as a power tool.
And again, who are the largest producers at the moment of semiconductors?
So the semiconductor market is divided in different segments, if you want. So semiconductors are not a commodity. And this is where this analogy that we might talk later about, as semiconductors being the new oil, falls a bit short. But semiconductors are always produced for a specific purpose. Some of them are a bit commodified if you think about memory chips. But if we think about chips, most chips, they're produced for a specific purpose, as a sensor in your car, as the brain of your smartphone, as some kind of logic chip that drives your machinery. And when we look at different parts of the market, different segments, different countries dominate. China itself produces a lot of chips on the low end, but if we go at the high end, and this is where a lot of the talk is going on, what's many people call cutting edge, there's actually just 3 companies being able or pursuing this, just 2 being able to produce it, which is Samsung in South Korea and TSMC in Taiwan. And a lot here has been around Taiwan. A lot of this Taiwan question is about these chips, and a lot of the policies that we see in the EU and the US is about luring these companies to produce on the US soil, whereas keeping China out of this high-end part of the market.
So basically, 2 companies in 2 specific countries share 90% of the market or something like this?
So basically, in a specific segment of the market, yes, that is to say in the segment of on-demand fabrication of the cutting-edge chips. So this segment of the market is where Amazon, Apple, Alibaba, all of the big technology leaders just design and then order their chips to be fabricated by these 3 companies that Nicholas have mentioned. And so, yes, indeed, they control all of the market. For, in general, the logic chips, we say that TSMC in Taiwan controls 65% of the market. And I think this number just plays to understand the extent of the geopolitical aspect of this industry, because Taiwan is such a strategic, sensitive element in the geopolitics today, and especially one of tension between the US and China.
Thank you for this clarification. I think that this really provides a very interesting context about something that could at first glance seem as a very techy and specific issue related to some parts of the value chains of products, which of course we consume on a daily basis. Let's go a little bit zooming into the subject matter of our conversation today, which is the response from the European Union to such a context which you just described. And the EU Chips Act, which has been announced in February 2022, somehow has been the official document so far, the official plan for the European Union equip themselves with a strategy in order to face this situation. And we've seen that to a certain extent, such an act represents a real break in Europe's industrial policy. How would you summarize the main measures included in this CHIP Act?
So the CHIPS Act is first, I think, a response to the policies we've seen in China and the US, and response to this shortage that we talked about. And in many ways, it mirrors the things that have been done in the US and China. The US has announced some time before the EU a $52 billion program, which we record this on a Tuesday. The 19th today, the Senate is going to vote on this measure. Let's see if it's going to go through in this polarized environment. But this was the headline figure that the EU wanted to match. And now the EU came out with a 43 billion euro program, which at the time almost equaled the US. Since then, the euro has depreciated. But basically, that was we really tried to match this. And I think that signifies the ambitions the EU really has here, is of playing in the same level with the US on this policy. And the idea of the CHIPS Act is threefold. The first is to strengthen the EU's R&D network by new investment in research and development. The second one is to get manufacturing, supposedly the high end. We're going to talk about this maybe later, but that's actually what we do. But supposedly the high end with subsidies to set up manufacturing in the EU. And the third pillar is to instate some kind of emergency measures in the EU that will allow the Commission to intervene if there is, again, a shortage. I think that what we should note is that I think from the three pillars, the manufacturing capacity is by far the most important one. So the Commission has not given us yet really good numbers of how they came up with this 43 billion number. We just know for the first pillar, it's going to be about 11 billion, of which just 3.5 to 4 billion is actually going to be EU money. The rest comes from member states. And a lot of this EU money that comes in is already marked for chips. So a lot of this is Horizon Europe funding that either was already marked for chips, some of it taken from some other research program, but not real new money in there. The big item, like the 30 billion, more than 30 billion, is probably going to come in Pillar 2, which is luring manufacturing through subsidies to the EU. And here the focus is really in the rhetoric on the high end. They call this cutting edge. But we see now the project announced last week that's not so much on the high end, so the definitions are a bit vague. And then basically having some emergency measures that would allow the EU to intervene. This is, I think, really new in a way, because on the first hand, it is an embrace of subsidies as a tool for the EU. So we have strict stated controls that normally should prevent member states from basically just buying in manufacturing, competing with the subsidies. Whereas here, the Commission itself is going to member EU countries and says, please spend money on this and get manufacturing through subsidies into your country. So really, the EU kind of changing here her shift from being the one that's supposed to monitor countries not to spend too much on subsidies to the one saying, please do this. So I think this is the first shift. The second shift is in this third pillar, in this kind of emergency measures, which foresee at least are intended to be a very hands-on management of the Commission of Supply Chain. So this includes, it's very much taken from the rule book of the vaccines. It includes joint procurement by the Commission on behalf of member states of chips. It includes basic export controls prohibiting companies to export abroad. And it also enforces companies that produce within the EU to supply EU companies first. And this is also kind of the idea that the Commission itself could manage a supply chain of this kind of magnitude in a moment of crisis, something we haven't seen before. So I think also there it is a shift in what we've seen so far. So far, the EU has always been against national subsidies. If we think about the comprehensive agreement on investment that we had with China, the core part of the agreement was about Chinese industrial policy. And the idea was, even though we might not have achieved this, but at least to take a step forward of curtailing Chinese subsidies in industrial policy. And now the Commission is kind of switching gears and itself proposing competing through subsidies in this international supply chain. So I think there really is a shift in our approach.
You are pointing out two major things over there. One, the very use of subsidies as a tool of industrial policy from something that used to be somehow discouraged or banned. And then the second part is how to intervene in the value chain of the production. I think that these two aspects will be worth to zoom in a bit further, because for the first one, it's really a notable shift from this long-held opposition to industrial subsidies, which were seen as detrimental to international competition. So, Pauline, how should we interpret such a shift?
So I think Nicholas summarized what is going on really well. In terms of interpreting such a shift, I think first it's interesting to see it from an institutional point of view. First, maybe we should also underline that some of the CHIPS Act measures still have to be passed through the institutions of the EU, that is to say the Council and the Parliament. So not all of it is for granted yet. And why is this important? It's important also because it reminds us that not all member states share this kind of new vision or shifting vision of industrial subsidies or this shifting vision of industrial policy at the EU level. So that's one thing that's important to say. Secondly, and that's what Nicholas mentioned, within the EU itself, we have this very interesting evolution where the Commission, which was historically in charge of ensuring competition at the EU level. And this is actually also, the basis of European integration in the first place, having a big market that is fair and integrated. And so we're seeing this shift in role, but not really this shift in actual organization. And so interestingly, DG Comp, who used to be in charge of curtailing and being kind of the police of subsidies at the EU level, is now in charge of creating the framework to push member states to invest their money into industrial projects. So that's one thing that we're seeing that is very interesting, and that also plays out into understanding the evolution of roles and relationships between different DGs at the EU level. And lastly, yes, what I wanted to just add is maybe that this shift still cannot be considered to be happening in all sectors. I think we still have to bear in mind that there seems to be a shift in conception from competitions between industries that may be between different EU member states, and a shift into thinking for industries where the EU as a whole is competing on the international stage. And for strategic sectors, maybe the medical or vaccine sectors that Nicholas have mentioned, or also the high-tech sectors, where the EU either doesn't have a lot of actors or just isn't really present, the EU as a whole has more interest into building its homegrown industry and acting as a bloc in a more geostrategic, geopolitical manner. And I think we will mention this later in the podcast, but that's also, I think, to be fully thought into this whole new rebranding of the Commission since President von der Leyen came to power as a geopolitical commission, thinking of how to enhance EU power from a autonomy, sovereignty way.
Thank you, Pauline. Nicholas, you wanted to add something on this?
Yeah, just one small point on this. I think what Rupolini said is really important, that you have on the one hand the Commission setting out an ambition, setting out we want this 43 billion euro CHIPS Act, we want to double our capacity. So really setting here the ambitions for the EU, but at the same time the EU Commission itself doesn't have autonomy over its budget, so it needs the member states to step in. And I think a lot of that, the problems that we're going to discuss a bit later about competition via subsidy is a problem that the EU basically needs member states to chip in. And then you get into the problem that does this happen in a way that actually is detrimental to the single market because different member states are competing over subsidies? And this is what state aid was supposed to curtail.
Yeah, indeed. That was my next question. How do you combine the principle of competition at the international level with the principle of competition within the internal market, and what kind of distortion might get into motion within this frame?
So the problem is exactly that we see member states competing over subsidies. So if you think about the EU subsidies framework, it was really intended to prevent competition between member states. Mm-hmm. We had different kind of economic models in the beginning in the EU single market, and the idea was to basically make sure, even though maybe in France there would be more state-owned enterprises, these would not compete unfairly via subsidies against, for instance, German enterprises. What we see now is with this new important project of common European interest, IPCEIs, is that because there's now this new ambitions on building industry through industrial policy happening since around 2017, we see this necessity. If you want to do that, you need subsidies, and this can only come from the member states, at least in the current institutional framework. And there we see competition by the member states for these industries, for these high-tech industries that we identified as strategic. And of course, this has the problem that then the richest member state can buy in high-tech industries to locate in there. And that's exactly what happened. If we look at who gets the new 17 billion euro Intel mega fab, that is with which Intel hopes to kind of catch up to TSMC and Samsung in producing these really cutting-edge chips, it's going to happen in Germany. And why is it happening in Germany? Germany is the richest member state, the one that has the most fiscal space, and they were willing to pay almost 7 billion euros for Intel, so 40% of the price of this factory, so Intel locates it in Germany. And there's two problems with this. On the first hand, this factory might have also been in somewhere else, no? It could have been in Italy, but Italy doesn't have the pockets maybe right now.
Or Poland or anywhere else.
Yeah. So there are many places where this could have happened, and now it's happening in the places already the richest. But on the second hand is also that you have that a company that is looking for locating their factory in Europe can now go to different governments and ask them, what do you offer me? And 40% is quite a high amount of subsidies there. How do you get those? Probably by basically playing out different countries within the EU, but also outside the EU to give you subsidies.
So that's definitely a criticality that will have to be observed, because this switch, even if it's a theoretical switch for the time being and so on, could also leak into other sectors as well. I mean, now it's the semiconductors are considered the strategic sector, which deserve this kind of special treatment. But who knows next year or in 2 years' time or 5 years' time, what else might be. So it's an interesting thing to observe also from this more general perspective about how the single market might change or might not change, what other kind of conflicts within the member states might come at play. So that's one thing, I would say, one thing that from a point of view, the EU Chips Act tries to find a solution theoretically, but might encounter a stumbling block or actually a boomerang effect on that side. The other thing, which we were saying before, is the fact that the proposal should support R&D and provide a legal basis for the EU member states to use such subsidized domestic semiconductor manufacturing to facilitate somehow trade measures to intervene in the supply chains. So Is this going to be enough? We see this criticality from the single market perspective, but how in practice would you see this need to build resilience in the supply chains when it comes to semiconductors? Is the measures that are foreseen in the CHIPS Act going to foster this intention that it's put in the writing of such a policy?
On this, and also building on what Nicholas had mentioned before, on the capacity that companies have to go to member states and kind of shop for subsidies, right? What is very interesting is that this is happening in a sector where it's really concentrated. We have an oligopoly with 3 companies actually able to win as much as 7 billion in subsidies in any EU countries. So in terms of communication and relationship between the private and the public sector, here we see a lot of risks. And going forward, this will also be intensified, as probably all of the sectors that will be considered strategic will also be sectors with very few market leaders. So that's one thing. Then on the second thing of how you ask, is this going to be enough? Here, I think what is really important to understand is the specifics about this market. Building a semiconductor factory takes a lot of money, and it's happening over several years. In the same manner, building a semiconductor, like Nicholas mentioned, they are very specific. And so they are fit for purpose, and it can take up to 6 months to build one chip, So in that sense, the problems that we have in the automotive sector since the COVID crisis are certainly not going to be fixed by the new factories that have been announced in Germany and in France. Certainly, at the international level, all of these massive investments by countries and companies are going to bring us to somewhere where we have more capacity for production. But still, does that mean that it was successful? In the sense that we still fear that in a few years from now, we might reach a situation of actually overcapacity in the sector. And so that will mean that the prices will tumble, and that the investments that the states have put in these big factories will just not pan out. And in this sense, I think we are a bit fearful of the idea that because of these economic and geopolitical rationales to invest into semiconductors, states are investing billions without any guarantees that A, they see any profits or returns, and B, that the market will, carry out those investments in the future. Lastly, also, I think we ought to have mentioned that in this context of shift in industrial subsidies and in the way we think industrial policy, there is a big lack of transparency, in the sense that the deals that are happening between the states and the companies are far from published publicly, essentially. And so, you would expect that when your country supports with billions a factory, you would know why it is investing so much. And in practice, this is just not the case.
Yeah, so just on this last point, so for the European Commission to consider subsidies, even in the IPCEI context, there has to be, on the one hand, they have to be somehow innovative, and this condition was weakened to attract this kind of manufacturing capacity. But at the same time, there has to be a funding gap. That means that these projects would not happen without public subsidies, and they would calculate this funding gap. And then they would say, okay, based on this assessment, there would be this funding gap, and therefore the government, and otherwise, if we don't provide for this funding gap, this project will not happen. I find this entirely incredible when we think of the context of chip manufacturing. So TSMC announced their profits for the last quarter for 3 months and just a week ago or 2 weeks ago, and it was like $8 billion. Why do companies like that have no problems? Yes, it's very expensive to build a foundry. Why do these companies need the subsidies to build them? The only reason simply is that they can basically ask governments to do so. And to some extent, there is this international competition that if we want this foundry to happen in Europe, we might have to pay subsidies. But it's, of course, it is a bit disingenuous if we pretend that this is really research and innovation. I think here we have to be a bit more honest with ourselves. So why are we doing this? And I think this is the problem with the current proposal, is it kind of it weakens these conditions. We have basically here the same people that's supposed to police the member states basically on this kind of ideas of a funding gap. The Commission is the one that's going to decide whether that's true or not, but they're also the ones that ask governments to do this. So to which extent are we here making the watchdog also the people that call the policy direction?
Since we are going towards the end of our conversation, assume that some of these issues that you have been just describing are actually sorted out, that actually this CHIPS Act works as a powerful tool in order to build capacity in that space for EU manufacturers to be leading the way on this. What would be the actual consequences, not for the value chains within the EU as such, but what will be the consequences for the global value chains related to the semiconductors? Would there be, for example, the risk of an overcapacity of production all of a sudden from like no one was producing, so it's very scarce and very valuable part of the value chains, but then it at some point becomes very much available and therefore incurring the opposite kind of problems, I wonder. And then secondly, what these or others elements, what kind of impact those elements would have on free trade at the EU and international level.
So I think first, there is a real risk of overcapacity. And this is almost baked into the market, the same way shortages from time to time are baked into the market. It just takes years to build a foundry. It takes months to kind of shift production, even if you have a foundry from one specific type of demand to another specific type of demand. So the capacity we have right now reflects what companies thought would be the demand now. And there's all the incentives in the market itself to kind of produce enough. So I think here, from just a management perspective, just by having a lag between producing and demand, because demand fluctuates with economic cycles, with innovation cycles, but demand takes years to build, there is a mismatch. And I think now, because we're pouring so much money from the governments in there, there's a real risk of basically overdoing it. And here, I think just to illustrate how long it will take, the foundry in Magdeburg that Intel announced will not open before 2027. So really like a long time out. So I think that's the first thing to understand, and there's real risk here. In terms of the international value chains, a lot about it is about market conditions. In the end, even if we kind of double our capacity in Europe, we can just do so much with subsidies, especially if we pour out so much money for just individual projects. And we will run out of subsidies, also of money to put into subsidies very soon. So a lot of it is really about Europe is not a massive, big market for chips, because we don't have the IT industry for IT goods that China has, or that is mostly East Asian. So here, I think our limits of what we can achieve through this are kind of, there's limits to this. But at the same time, also, there's limits to what you can do geopolitically with one foundry by itself. Because also here, again, going back to the US example, US sanctions work through the control of intellectual property, of technologies, of software, not through control of foundries. So here's whereas if you think about the oil example, chips being the new oil, if you own the well, you can basically decide just to sell it to whoever you want. Chips, really, it is not just owning the well. You also need to own the equipment to build this. You need the software that runs on the equipment. You need the engineers. You need the kind of contracts and the design from. So it's a really complex supply chain. And I think here, just building these capacities, which the CHIPS Act sets out to do, that's just one building block. And I don't think it's the most important one. Much more important is, do we actually have the policy tools that allow us to intervene if there's, for instance, a geopolitical intervention against us? Do we have resilience, not just from the EU side, from international side? So if we think about Taiwan, there's a real geopolitical risk, but there's also a real just environmental risk. They have earthquakes, for instance. They have droughts that could affect this foundry. So there's a lot of local risk that we might want to diversify globally, and just the EU itself doing this will not be enough. So there's many different parts here, and I think that's why the trade story in the global cooperation is so important. Yes, there might be a need for Europe to take part in the diversification away from just the island of Taiwan. Yes, there is maybe a geopolitical point of kind of diversifying supply. But in the end, we need everyone to cooperate. And if we would do that, also we could lower the price of subsidies, because right now the EU and the US are competing over subsidies. That's not a good place to be. I think we really have to invest here in the trade things. And there is where the CHIPS Act, I think, is problematic, because the measure it introduces to intervene in emergency are disruptive. And if other countries do the same, we being at the end of the supply chain, not importing a lot of chips itself, but a lot of products with chips, not being a big market with demand power, but with in this kind of things, makes us quite vulnerable. If everyone would introduce this kind of measures we do, we might end up in the next shortage or the oversupply, and then if we all start putting export control, we are in a much worse situation than we were right now.
Thank you, Nicholas. We are really going towards the end of our conversation, but I don't want to leave without asking Pauline if she has anything to add or like some final remarks regarding this whole story, which both of you have actually been monitoring and analyzing and writing about, and we are going to have the link in the show notes about the several publications, blog posts that we've been writing in the past few months.
Thanks a lot, Giuseppe. So indeed, just to maybe wrap things up, but also build on what Nicholas just said, I think to some extent, this sector has to also be thought into the global context of trade at the moment. The COVID crisis has translated in a lot of different sectors in supply chains issues. And what this has showed for companies is that if you have only one supplier and you rely on just-in-time delivery for everything, you are going to be in trouble. And so this new idea, this new understanding that, you cannot have everything just in time and that you have to build resilience and that you have to, build stocks in order to secure your production lines is something that all businesses have understood. And so to some extent, there's some presumption on the part of all of these countries across the world trying to decide that they are going to manage the supply chain, because ultimately private actors do it best. So that's just one thing. Secondly, on the question of will this work and to what extent will this be positive for the world, it is true that having all countries investing in building foundries will take some pressure off some bottlenecks. And ultimately, we could say it's a good thing. But where I completely follow Nicholas is where we have to bear in mind that even though we think that the chip factory is the most important bottlenecks, there are other important steps in the value chains, other bottlenecks that translate into, geopolitical leverage for the US to impose sanctions, or bottlenecks that could create big hurdles in the supply chain. And I think that this is where the Pillar 1 of the CHIPS Act is important to say that just the EU should indeed have more actors in the ecosystem in general and have more of a foothold. And why not have a more strategic vision for the long term, but still, this kind of panic overinvestment into factories is a very expensive endeavor for public money, but also has ramifications for how we do industrial and trade policy that have to be considered.
Pauline, just really a final question, maybe just a provocation. Is vertical integration then back in fashion in industrial circles? Do you think this is some sort of back to the future scenarios that we will see more and more versus just-in-time and flexible models of production?
That's a very interesting question, Giuseppe.
I know this could be another podcast per se, but...
That's indeed, it's probably another podcast. So I think to some extent, vertical integration is back in style because companies want to have secure supply chains. And what is a more secure partner than your own mother or daughter company, right? But why the chip sector is interesting is that these foundries that we have mentioned a bunch of times now are indeed very expensive to build and very hard to operate. And this is why companies actually cannot vertically integrate, at least wholly, because they just don't have the know-how and they don't think that it makes economic sense to have the know-how. And this is how we end up with companies such as Amazon, Google, Apple, or also the big tech in China, which are, the companies that are some of the best placed in the world to invest massively. And even these companies are still in contract with TSMC to build their own their chips. So to say, I think companies would like more vertical integration, but in some subsegments, it's just not realistic.
Thank you, Pauline and Nicholas. Now we really need to close down our discussion, but we're going to keep our eyes on it because, of course, it's a very, very interesting conversation, and also, as we say, it has a lot of ramification in industrial policy, single market conversations, trade, and of course geopolitics. So thanks a lot, and as usual, you can read in open access all the analysis by our scholars on our website www.bruegel.org. And I would like to thank all our listeners for following us, and until next time, bye bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Giuseppe. Thanks, Nicholas.